Chapter 13. Isabella looked into her mirror. There were some dark circles beneath her eyes. She'd been having difficulty sleeping from the strain in her neck, the thoughts of the present, and the nightmares of days past. She simply didn't like this place. It made her feel suffocated. Today ought to have been a day that she could smile boldly. She was temporarily rid of the advances of Duke Albert. She had something of an ally in Duke Valerio, though his objectives were as yet unknown to her. The happiness was darkened, however, by the fact that she had become the most notorious princess in all of Dauphine. The ambassadorial reception and her engagement thereafter would have raised some eyebrows, but never to this extent. It would be no exaggeration to say the entire kingdom would take notice of her now. "Are you all right, Your Highness?" Alice's question broke her from her thoughts, the girl's expression one of utmost worry. Everyone kept asking her that. From their perspective, they likely thought she blamed herself for Count Faust's death. Some of them just wanted her to start talking so that they could have some information, but others were genuinely concerned. She took Alice to be one of the latter. "I will be," Isabella said. It was as much a hope for the future as it was a statement for the present. If you and the Duke of the Isles do." Alice hesitated. "Speak freely," Isabella urged. "If you really wed that man, I would come with you," Alice said. "If you wanted, I mean, to help keep you safe from the pirate." Isabella was tempted to assure, but found herself unwilling to divulge the details behind their arrangement for fear that it would leak. Much can happen in 6 months. Alice walked closer, standing politely behind. "I'm scared, Your Highness. Hundreds of people are approaching me, asking me things about you. I don't know what to say, what to do. People that wouldn't even look at me twice are trying to invite me for tea, now." Isabella turned from the mirror and looked at Alice. "Would it calm your heart if I called upon another personal attendant?" Alice's face paled, and she lowered her head briefly before raising it back up with fire in her eyes. "I don't want to stop serving you." Isabella was surprised to hear that. "Why not?" "Because one of them might replace me," Alice said. And Her Highness is very pleasant to serve, and to look at." Isabella smiled. "You're very kind, Alice." She rose to her feet. "Would you like some advice?" Alice nodded vigorously. "Please. Tell them things that everyone knows," Isabella suggested. "It'll be enough not to offend them, but they'll get the message." Alice thought for a moment, then gave a more ponderous nod. "And if I want to help you?" "I don't want you to get involved," Isabella said. "But I want to help you, Your Highness." Isabella closed her eyes. Alice could easily get hurt, just as she had in her last life. "Please," Alice insisted. Isabella opened her eyes, and felt her resolve waver before that pleading face. "When you give them common information," Isabella began hesitantly, "they'll ask for deeper details. Start answering, but hesitate. Cut yourself off. Chances are, they'll reveal who they're gathering information on behalf of to encourage you to talk. If you can bring that information to me, it would be helpful." She pointed at Alice. "But I don't want you jeopardizing yourself, Alice." Alice beamed. "Leave it to me, Your Highness." Isabella walked over and retrieved a letter, then held it out to Alice. "Please deliver this to the Major Domo. The recipient is Lady Abigail in the Archduke Felix's estate," Isabella instructed. Now that she had rid herself of immediate threats, it was time to begin spinning a web of connections. Others would surely be doing just the same, and she needed to be ready to stand tall against them. Prince Claude sat at the head of the table, looking at the various nobles arrayed before him. He was tall and well-built, but unlike most of the pale-skinned and fair-haired royalty of Dauphine, had darker skin and hair common in the peoples of the continent to the south of Dauphine. He killed Faust just for that. Claude stirred his tea with an expression of concern on his face. Princess Isabella tried to argue for suspension and fines, but one of the nobles said, then shook his head. Edgar called it treason. He cut off the count's head then and there. He left his body in the throne room for hours before he allowed it to be cleaned. "Do you know if the king was especially close with Isabella, Claude?" Another asked. Claude shook his head. I'd never heard her name before today. She was just one of many princesses as far as I was concerned. Do you think she was involved in the decision? The nobles looked between each other, and then shook their heads. No. She gave a fair ruling, and looked distressed when it wasn't followed. The others concurred with his assessment. If anything, Duke Valerio might have been the one to encourage the king, but that's rumor alone. None of my spies in the royal palace have any indication of the Duke visiting the king before today. But now the Duke has an excuse to visit whenever he wants, another pointed out. He's secured an engagement with Princess Isabella. He'll be a fixture of the royal palace. Faust was a dear friend. Claude sighed. What's the wider reaction like? Count Faust had a lot of friends, Your Highness, one of the nobles said simply. Those that aren't here today are banding together tightly, expecting the worst. Given how excessive the punishment was, they are not planning on a simple protest. One of the more eager nobility leaned into the table. This is your opportunity, Claude. To seize your birthright. Claude looked into his tea. Do you know what my father often called me? He looked up. The tribal prince. He stole my mother away on a military campaign, married her forcibly, and when I was born, disinherited me and executed her for adultery because I didn't share any of his features. He set his cup down. He never wanted me as his successor for even a moment. I'm not sure he ever thought I was his son. Your father's gone, one of them pointed out. What he branded me as remains, Claude countered. The tribal prince. A bastard in all but name. People could know you as the savior prince if you step in, one of them insisted. Do you think people will care about your appearance when there's a tyrant on the throne, executing people arbitrarily? Historically it's been the case. Claude crossed one leg over another then looked out of the window. I don't want to rebel. How about this, then? An aged noble who'd been silent thus far leaned in. You move closer to the capital. You do nothing. If I'm right, the king will soon be challenged. And if I know Edgar too, he'll react to those challenges with violent oppression. It's only a matter of time before someone deposes or assassinates him. The wizened elder pointed. And that's when you step in. Not to rebel, but to restore order. Claude looked out of the window thoughtfully. All of his assembled allies waited for his words. I'll move to my estate just outside the capital, Claude finally said. The nobles breathed a sigh of relief, then expressed gratitude to the prince. Perhaps I can do some good in this life, Claude mused quietly enough that few heard him. Asterisk. Archduke Felix of Ballet sat at the dinner table with his daughter Abigail. She had quite a large portion of food in front of her, but ate it with the grace that was expected of a noble lady. She was picturesque in his view, with the dark hair and maroon eyes of House Ballet. Without a shadow of a doubt, there was no figure more suited to sit beside the king than his daughter. He gave an approving nod, then turned back to his own meal. Since you have difficulties making them, I've found you a friend, Felix said. Abigail looked at him. Thank you, father. Felix tried not to frown at her abrupt, out-of-place response to his declaration. Despite her manners, the girl had no charm. Abigail would stiffly repeat what he taught her without timing or finesse. She was awkward beyond belief, like a wooden doll given life without the soul to express emotions. She hadn't been able to make friends despite her position as the Archduke's daughter, and that said a great deal about her incapability. Princess Isabella has sent you an invitation for a tour of the palace gardens, Felix continued. She's close to the king, as he so aptly demonstrated. You're going to get close to her, and she's going to help you. Yes, father, Abigail answered. Thank you, father. Felix stabbed his steak to vent his frustrations, then looked at her. Pay close attention to the way Isabella acts. By rumor she's like you, cold, shy. But even despite that, she can hold a conversation. She knows what to say, and can charm a room. She seems to have charmed the king, by my eye. He tapped his knife against the plate, and it clanked loudly. Study her, Abigail. Abigail went silent a moment before nodding. Yes, father. Felix shook his head, taking a long drink. Asterisk. Arthur stood before his master, the Archwizard of Dovahane. Even Arthur didn't know his name, he was just the Archwizard. Though aged, he still commanded a formidable presence merely sitting in the chair behind his desk. He looked up at Arthur, and despite the fact his eyes were clouded and blind, it felt like they saw right through him. Attending the ambassadorial reception was bad enough, his master said. But now I hear you're at the nexus of the execution of a prominent count? Arthur fixed his glasses, then said quietly, all I did was send a formal complaint to the king. Why? The Archwizard asked. Why should it matter to you if some girl was abused? I don't care if they beat her to death with napkins in that ambassadorial reception, and you shouldn't either. Rather, I would expect you to stand by and watch them beat her with a look of disinterest on your face. Arthur closed his eyes and inhaled, taking the words without response. If we present ourselves as a political entity, then we become subject to political meddling, the Archwizard continued. You may think that merely because you can command ice and fire that you're all-powerful, but the fact remains that we can and will be overwhelmed by the royal court if they will it. I apologize, Arthur said. But I secured valuable materials for study. I entered into an agreement with Master Ludovico to trade off our excess supply for theirs. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. Materials, the Archwizard repeated, then sighed. That was your trade with the princess. Your support for help securing materials for your studies? I agreed to help her with the monologue, Arthur eventually admitted. The complaint was my own initiative. I just didn't think the king would. The Archwizard laughed, then rose to his feet. My boy, I'm afraid you've been manipulated. I can't exactly blame you. I'm told she's pretty and young, both of which are things that might make her appear non-threatening, especially to a man. He walked around the desk and put his hand on Arthur's shoulder. She doesn't care about the monologue. She's using you to advance politically. Arthur looked at his master. The princess could form a monologue on her own. She showed it to me. All she wants is a finishing one in her mind. I can't go back on my word. The Archwizard pointed. You went back on your word to me, boy. You said that you wouldn't get involved in politics, and here you are doing just that. I gave my word to her, Arthur insisted. Ask yourself which you value more, your connection with this girl, or your position as my successor. The Archwizard shook his head. It's not happening. If you speak to her again for whatever purpose, I'll cut you off. Arthur's vision narrowed in surprise. You're a promising student, but I can tolerate mediocrity in my successor if it means the preservation of the office's neutrality, the Archwizard said flatly. This misadventure of yours is over. The Archwizard walked out, his blindness impeding none of his ability to navigate. Once he left, Arthur lowered his head. This was the first time that he'd ever been seriously reprimanded, and it made him reflect. His actions had caused the death of one noble, and a significant stir among the others. Arthur respected his master a great deal, and so took his words seriously. Had Isabella manipulated him? He tried to think back to all she'd said and done. In his eyes, she came across as straightforward. But perhaps that was all a guise to make the pieces fall where she wanted them to. He honestly didn't think so. He'd done what he had of his own accord. Lingering in the back of his mind, though. I killed that man, not Isabella, he told himself. I don't want her to think that was on her hands. It was on mine. I'll wear it gladly. If she had been manipulating him, so be it. But if she hadn't, a man had died, and she might feel responsible. Just after, she'd immediately been forced into an engagement with the Duke of the Isles, a barbaric pirate lord. Would he continue the trend of miseries by severing all ties with her and reneging on his promise to help form her monologue? Or was he willing to risk his position as heir to the greatest magician in the realm? Knight Commander Gasper sat in the cathedral with Archbishop Pius. The man gave him a saintly smile. He had silverish hair like the royal family, but deep white eyes that gave him the impression of being beyond this world, somehow, removed from it. Take your time, Gasper. Say what you need to, Pius encouraged. Gasper looked at his hands. He stayed silent for a long while, choosing his words carefully. This had tormented him ever since he'd done it. "The king told me to kill a man," he said. "Count Faust. He wasn't a saint, by any means, but he had done nothing deserving of death." He rubbed his hands together, then looked at the archbishop. I haven't been able to sleep, just thinking about it. The eternal word says that no man should carry out an unjust sentence, even at the cost of their life. But he said, voice breaking. The eternal word also says that none must rebel against the divinely anointed rulers of the realm, Pius continued. If the gods didn't want you to carry out that action, they would not have allowed it. I can't swallow these contradictions, Father. Gasper shook his head in stress. Will I burn in the hells? Is that my fate, to burn? I'm scared. It feels like I've been forced to compromise my faith with my position every second of every day since that man ascended to the throne. I'm not. He hesitated. I'm not cut out to be the Knight Commander. Pius ran his hand over his face, and the smile that he'd been sporting died. He grabbed Gasper's shoulder and jerked him around. I'm going to say some things for your benefit, Pius said. Faith dies in the royal court. What? Gasper said, aghast. The gods, the hells, notions of sinners and saints, they burst into flame the moment you enter the echelons of power, Pius continued. Faith is a political tool. It's nothing more than that. It's used to placate the people into thinking there will be some justice in the world in the face of the immense indignities they endure. Archbishop, what? Gasper's lips trembled. I was hoping you would have learned this lesson by now. Pius released his shoulder. But instead you still come crying to me about these things. If you had stood up to the king, you would have been just another head rolling on the ground of an unjust world. Archbishop Pius rose to his feet. All that you need to be concerned about is how to strengthen the church's position, Pius said. To intertwine the secular and the theological all the closer. Let this incident serve as a lesson to you. The archbishop pointed at Gasper's face. The church is only another player in this game. The time for our gambit is long overdue, and you're going to be at the heart of that. So cease your whining, and remember your duty. The archbishop left, leaving Gasper alone with what had been said. The man lowered his head into his big hands. The expression on his face was one of profound despair. Chapter 14. Isabella looked up at Abigail as they stood in the gardens of the royal palace. She's even taller than I remembered, Isabella thought. I suppose I was always looking up at her from afar when she was queen, so it would have been hard to tell. Lady Abigail of Ballet stood as tall as her father, who most certainly wasn't a short man. If she were to don heels, she'd probably be taller than even Duke Valerio. Isabella thought Abigail was quite beautiful, but her face was stern and hard, again, like her father. She had very thick black hair which curled naturally, and dark red eyes. In truth, Isabella had invited her here under false pretenses. The Archduke thought that she would help arrange a marriage between Abigail and King Edgar too. But there wasn't a chance that Edgar would marry a woman taller than himself. He was quite petty and vainglorious, and placed stock more on image than ability. Besides, she'd never curse a woman with that man. Well, perhaps Bernadetta. Isabella needed a connection with the Archduke. In truth, she'd always felt some sympathy toward Abigail, who seemed to have been jerked around her entire life by forces beyond her control until her death. She couldn't recall a time where Abigail had tried to do another harm. Rather, she did her best to be an able queen, no matter her pairing. I'm very glad you came, Lady Abigail. She gestured behind her. I intended for us to take a walk through the royal gardens. Thank you, Your Highness, Abigail responded at once. Isabella stared up at her, then started walking. Abigail followed along, and soon enough they'd joined side by side. Your father wants you to marry the king, Isabella said straight out of the gate, studying Abigail's reaction. There didn't seem to be any. What do you want? I want what my father wants, Abigail responded immediately. What would you rather be doing right now instead of talking to me? Isabella pushed. Abigail looked at her. I'm sorry, Your Highness. I didn't mean it like. Isabella stopped herself, then rephrased, "What do you enjoy doing?" "I like to read, go horseback riding, and watch the hounds in the kennel. I haven't had the chance to do any of that lately." "I also like to read, go horseback riding, and watch the hounds in the kennel," Abigail responded. Isabella smiled sadly. "Did your father tell you that people like others that have hobbies in common?" Abigail looked over in what might have been surprise, but her expression was unchanged. "I'm sorry, Your Highness." Isabella thought for a moment, then decided to try a different approach. "Have you ever noticed that your father doesn't have any friends?" Abigail looked over without a response, but she seemed on the cusp of defending her father. "He has people that obey him, but he doesn't have any friends," Isabella continued. "He has subjects and cooperators, but no friends. That means that all of the advice that he's given you has been, well, I imagine not good. But, my father..." Abigail finally tried to speak for herself, only to find no words to call upon. "He's a good ruler. His people love him. And he taught me and my sister everything since our mother died. He's protected me my entire life." Isabella looked at Abigail as they walked through the beautiful gardens. She knew that the Archduke loved his daughter. He'd seceded from the kingdom after her death, and had reportedly become a hollow shell of a man. That was why it was so hard to understand why he pushed her so hard, why he endeavored to place her on the throne by any means necessary. It wasn't something that she could understand. Why would anyone want this life for their beloved daughter? "He told me not to trust anyone here," Abigail continued. "That I can't let them know anything real." Isabella nodded. "He's concerned for you. But, could me knowing what you enjoy hurt you or your family?" Abigail took those words in silence as they walked through the garden, coming to a large pond where the koi fish roamed. Abigail looked at the fish, almost entranced. "I like our mammoths," Abigail finally said. "Mammoths?" Isabella raised a brow. "I've never seen one." "They are very cute," Abigail said, rubbing her hands together. "The baby mammoths especially. They have cute little faces that look like they're smiling, and they run underneath the legs of the older ones." Isabella listened patiently, but Abigail trailed off. To prompt her, Isabella said, "Tell me more." "The baby mammoths have soft fur, but the older ones have coarser fur," Abigail continued. "The biggest of them are about 4 times my height. They are playful. They like to touch you all over with their trunks." She looked at Isabella, then gestured. "You couldn't wear a dress near them. They'd tear it off. But they're nice. The ones we raise are, at least. Elsewhere they get hunted by the northern tribes, so they have to be aggressive." "Do you like any other northern animals?" Isabella pressed. "We have reindeer," Abigail continued. "And musk oxen. Those are both safe to raise. In the far north, the ground starts to turn to ice. That's where things get dangerous. There are walruses. A walrus is a thick-bodied animal with a flat face that has long tusks. They have brown, wrinkly skin, and flippers instead of arms. They swim through ice water like it's not cold at all. And then there's snow bears and saber cats. Snow bears are pure white, and they're far larger than the bears near here. Saber cats are large cats that have long, dagger-like fangs. I don't particularly like them, because they both kill seals, which are my favorite." "Seals? I haven't told you about them," Abigail realized, looking at Isabella. She stopped abruptly. "I'm sorry. I'm rambling. Do you have any artwork for these animals?" Isabella asked, genuinely interested. Abigail looked over, hesitant to say more. Eventually, she nodded. "I'd love it if you could bring some next time," Isabella said. "The North. You must love it very much." Abigail nodded. "You must miss it very much," Isabella concluded. Abigail didn't say anything, quietly watching the fish in the pond. "I quite enjoy magic," Isabella said. "I enjoy watching it, reading about it. And soon, I hope, practicing it. My father always forbade me from learning it because it's not a particularly ladylike activity. But I enjoy it. I'm going to do what I want." Abigail looked at Isabella thoughtfully. "I've only told one other person that," Isabella said. And if the king found out, he'd likely punish me. So, it's our secret. Abigail nodded seriously. She looked brighter than when they'd begun this conversation, but perhaps that was only Isabella's projection. Abigail likely felt as suffocated as Isabella did in this place. She was glad that she'd arranged this. But other people would take note, too. There were many watching eyes, especially on her. Let them watch. Isabella intended on giving them quite the show. Her sleepless nights hadn't been without merit. She'd realized what needed to be done to crawl out of the pitfall Edgar had dug her into. I'm going to ruin Duke Albert, Isabella reaffirmed. Before, I merely planned to break him and Edgar apart, and then let him self-destruct on his own as he did in my first life. But ruining him myself is the easiest way to break away from Edgar in the eyes of all. So long as I manage it before he's assassinated or deposed. I shouldn't fall alongside him. And the cudgel she'd use? Archduke Felix. She had no reason to feel guilty, though, because the Archduke would benefit from Duke Albert's downfall as much as she did. Isabella was certain he wouldn't enjoy it as much as she would, however. Would you like to go horseback riding next time? Isabella suggested to Abigail. After the artwork, of course. It was hard to tell if Abigail was pleased with the suggestion, but she nodded. Thank you, Your Highness. Courtship in Dauphine was a highly traditional, almost ritualized affair. Typically, it was done with the supervision of both parties' parents, but Isabella's mother had died not long after she'd been born, and her father had obviously died recently. Perhaps Valerio had parents, but she had never heard of them. He certainly never mentioned them. In a case like this, then, they would both be granted high amounts of autonomy. Certain customs needed to be observed legally, but beyond that, they would be free to do as they pleased. Duke Valerio and Isabella sat having tea in a secluded pavilion in the royal garden. There was a small pond surrounding them with bridges to reach this area. This had always been her favorite spot. People could see, but they couldn't hear. That was precisely what she wanted. How have you been? Valerio asked. You look tired. I can tell despite the makeup, even. I'm usually bad at that. I am tired. Isabella looked to the pond around them. I had to reconsider a great many things after Faust's execution. Valerio leaned back in his chair. I'm getting the sense this isn't the first execution you've seen. Isabella confirmed that with a nod. My father was fond of them as well. His were more purposeful. At the very least, he chose his targets better. She looked at him, deciding to cut to business. What have you heard about what happened? I've heard quite a few rumors about how horrible I am, Duke Valerio said. Apparently I forced myself on you, and the king engaged us to hide the shame. As for execution mess, it's a maelstrom of chaos. People are factionalizing. The largest faction supports the disinherited Prince Claude, I'm told. I've heard the same. Isabella sipped her tea. I wanted to codify how our arrangement is going to work. It would make me more comfortable if I could know what it is you want of me, and how this benefits you. The attention is unwanted, but I can turn it to my advantage, Valerio said. Your brother is funneling me more money than before for his armada. But I suspect you're wondering about what I want from you, specifically. Indeed, Isabella confirmed. Despite what everyone is murmuring, I don't have much of a handle over how the king behaves. You saw the way he disregarded me when I suggested a punishment for Faust. My allies, my backing. They are non-existent. My choice to follow through was just instinct, Valerio said, looking at her right in the eye. I'll admit, I have someone I trust inside the royal court. They've done good work for me, but I feel like you can help me in ways I won't be able to predict. Instinct, Isabella repeated. People usually say that when they're lying, I've found. Valerio smiled. I haven't been able to figure out how you'd have known about the Republic of Ambrose's grain woes. There are other incongruities surrounding you, too. That's more than instinct. Isabella regarded him evenly. In this place, allies could turn to enemies overnight. She'd need to keep that in mind. Reversing the question, what do you want from me? Beyond a wall between you and Duke Albert, naturally, Valerio asked. I want freedom of movement, Isabella said. Everything I do is observed by the royal staff, particularly the major domo. He is a man that can and will be bought, so I can't trust him to be impartial. I'd like to use your name to exit the palace freely under the pretext of outings for our courtship. There are things I need to attend to in the capital. So, come pick you up once a day, take you out? Valerio nodded. That's no trouble. Do you have a guard you can trust? No, Isabella said with a shake of her head. I don't think I'll need one. Have you ever walked through the capital alone? Valerio questioned non-judgmentally. Isabella hesitated to answer, but eventually said, No, I haven't. Considering your newfound fame and striking appearance, I think it'd be unwise to travel alone. Valerio leaned in. I could provide one of my best men. He's a eunuch from a country overseas, and he handles a sword like few have ever seen. Isabella stared at him without response. But from the gaze I'm getting, I suspect you think I'd be using him to spy on you. Valerio tsked and leaned back. Tell you what. You recently came across 1,000 gold. What do you say we go and buy you a sword? Isabella frowned. I can't fight. No, no. Valerio shook his head. A hired sword to watch your back. Isabella hesitated. Men like that are notoriously unreliable. And pirates can't be reasonable people, Your Highness, Valerio countered. Holy paladins have unimpeachable character. They certainly can't be bought, can't be corrupted. They certainly wouldn't heed the words of a tyrant in cutting off the heads of people arbitrarily. Isabella took his point silently, waiting for him to continue. What do you say that I take you somewhere right now? Valerio offered, rising to his feet. I know a place packed to the brim with people that could go toe-to-toe with the holy paladins in this place, and they're far more honorable. Isabella frowned. That can't be possible. The world is wider than anyone can imagine, Valerio said, offering his hand. Shall we, Your Highness? Isabella took his hand and stood up. Just Isabella, she said. At least while we're out. Of course. Wouldn't want people to think the silver-haired, burgundy-eyed beauty was a princess by using her title, Valerio said sarcastically. Chapter 15 Isabella watched the warriors training throughout the wide-open hall that Valerio had taken her to. On the outside, this place looked like a fancy bank. Deep inside, however, countless well-kept warriors sparred amongst each other. Isabella didn't know very much about fighting, but they didn't look clumsy or poorly trained. Rather, it reminded her of when she'd entered the training barracks of the Holy Paladins. What did you call this place? Isabella asked Valerio. She wore a large black cloak, and had stuffed all of her hair within the hood to conceal herself. The court of Condottieri, Valerio answered, watching the people fight. Who are these people? She asked him. Why do you think they are reliable? And of Hain, the eldest son takes all, Valerio said. But this tradition started in Ambrose, actually. Sons that didn't stand to inherit anything would take arms and armor and pick up warfare as a profession. They became condottieri. He looked over to her. That tradition was exported here. Most of the people you're looking at are landless nobles. Isabella looked again with a new perspective. She supposed that not every noble could earn a living serving as a knight for a family. Or perhaps they simply didn't desire it. Instead, they found employment here. The ships I raided at sea started hiring these people, Valerio reflected. The only time we ever struggled was when condottieri were aboard a ship. There was a bounty on me in this court, for a time. He looked over to her. So, I'm speaking from personal experience when I say they're much more reliable than other mercenaries. Isabella played with a ring on her finger. Honestly, she didn't know what she looking for in a bodyguard. She looked at Valerio, deciding that she could rely on his insight. Who do you think is the best fighter among them? Isabella asked. That man, Valerio pointed to a lithe man who seemed to move around as swiftly as a rabbit. He fought against two people on his lonesome. But he'd be a terrible bodyguard. Isabella looked at Valerio in confusion. Good fighting doesn't count for everything, Valerio continued. You want someone with good situational awareness. Someone that can tell when something is off, who can tell when things are dangerous. Ideally, you want to avoid ending up in danger at all. Valerio pointed to the corner. That man. He'd be good. Isabella followed his finger, where it finally fell upon the man who stood still in the very corner of the room. He was broad, with a thick body, thick arms, thick legs, and a thick head concealed by a helmet. He trained with a dummy, alone. Why him? Isabella asked. He hasn't taken his eyes off me since I entered the room, Valerio said. That's the sort of threat assessment you need. If I were to guess, he has Orcish blood. Very difficult to sneak up on orcs. They have some sort of sixth sense, and reflexes that could make a cat cry with envy. At Valerio's praise, Isabella looked over to the manager decisively, and the man walked up to her. Could you bring the broad man over? She asked, pointing him out. And give me his name, if you would. Ah. The man looked over. His name is Randolph. If I may be so bold, my lady. He rubbed his hands together, choosing his words carefully. I believe you are of quite high stock. Randolph is quite unbecoming of noble sensibilities. Unbecoming how? Isabella questioned. Do you mean baseborn? I don't care about such things. No, he's... The manager rubbed his hands together, then said delicately, very sassy. And unrepentantly vulgar. Is he disloyal? Isabella asked. No, never that, the manager assured. He'll do precisely what's asked of him. Just impolitely. Isabella looked at Valerio, who shrugged. She looked back at the manager, then said decisively, prepare a contract. Asterisk. Isabella and Valerio sat in a stately reception room not inferior to any that one might find in a noble parlor. The door opened, and Randolph walked in, his helmet off. He had a bald, blocky head marred by scars. His eyes immediately went to Valerio, and he froze in place. Gods damn it, Randolph said with a heavy Western Dopain accent, then walked back out and shut the door. She hadn't heard many people with a Western accent. It was simple and direct, often called the workman's dialect. Isabella looked at Valerio questioningly. Do you know him? I tend to have that effect on those with Orcish blood, Valerio explained. Why? I told you. They react to danger, he responded cryptically. It took a few moments, but the door reopened, and Randolph inched back inside. He shut the door, standing right beside it as if ready to depart at any moment. Presumably I'm not to be guarding that devil, Randolph said, gesturing at Valerio. If that bloody bastard needs guards, he's doing tripe miles above my pay grade. So, miss. I take it you're my client. That's right, she confirmed. Valerio rose to his feet, and Randolph reached for the doorknob. Valerio merely shot out his cuffs, then said politely, I'll leave you to him. When Valerio left, Randolph pulled out a cloth and wiped his head for sweat. Bloody bones are aching after that. He looked at her. I hope he's not a fixture of this job. He's my fiancé, Isabella responded. He wiped his face with one of his big hands. And here I thought alcoholism was a distant prospect, not a near future. Why does he frighten you so much? Isabella asked. Why is the sky blue? Why do seagulls view my head as a perfect target? He shook his head as he walked closer to the couch opposite her. If I knew the secrets of the bloody universe, I wouldn't be wasting my days away as a condottiere. You don't have any notion? Isabella pressed. He said you have Orcish blood. My mother said as much, Randolph said, picking up the contract that had been drafted. I assumed she was giving an excuse as to why I was born with this face. He looked up. So, I'm guarding the precious flower as she traipses about the capital, am I? Isabella nodded, impressed he read it so quickly. In short. If only I was born rich instead of handsome, he said sarcastically. Very well. 8 gold per day. I shan't barter. Isabella discreetly pulled a pouch out of her boots, retrieved 16 gold coins, and set them on the table. For tomorrow, she explained. So you don't take on any other jobs. Randolph took one of the coins and bit into them, nodding just afterward. "A wise decision, my lady. Their graveyards are full of idiots who dithered at paying my fee." He flicked the coin. "I'll get me things." Asterisk asterisk asterisk. For the first time in both her lives, Isabella wandered the capital without significant oversight. She had obviously toured the streets before, but it had always been a very controlled experience. It was somewhat jarring, frankly, to be just one face among many. The many noises and sights and sounds were slightly overwhelming, but he's like a human wedge, Isabella thought as Randolph walked ahead of her, clearing a path. Randolph had already effortlessly caught a pickpocket. She hadn't brought anything worth stealing, but his competence was on display immediately. No one had as much as pushed her. Nothing seemed to slip by her guardian. She hadn't known what to expect with him, but he was already proving to be worth the gold. Isabella finally came to a grand building that was fenced off, and heavily guarded. She told Randolph to stop, and peered beyond. The chateau seemed every bit as grand as any of the wings of the royal palace. She saw a fountain beyond, and an immaculate garden easily peer to the one where she'd had tea with Valerio this morning. This was Duke Albert's art auction house. It took a great deal to ruin a duke. Slave trading, domestic abuse, murder, kidnapping, rape. So long as these crimes were done to the right people, the most that would happen was a slap on the wrist or perhaps a fine. King Edgar too wouldn't care if Duke Albert was eating babies daily, so long as they weren't important babies. "Ah, the finer arts," Randolph said, leaning up against the gate. "I, myself, am a great admirer of the works of Santiago. His morbid aestheticism and chiaroscuro of desolation speak to my deep connection with the sublime decay, and my unending fascination with our corporeal transience." Isabella looked at him, baffled at a few of his words. "You spent 8 gold to take me to a bloody art show," he continued incredulously. "I'm appreciative that you've deigned to bestow some of your gilded purse upon my lowly person, but these places are generally quite safe." "You like art?" she asked. "I consider myself a connoisseur of the unobtainable." "A dilettante, if you're insufferably pretentious," Randolph said, vigilantly watching the street behind them. "I've got enough problems without throwing gold at pretty colors. Don't even have a bloody house to frame paintings at." Isabella looked through the gate. "There's a big shift coming in the art world." She pulled her hood down lower. "People are tired of the grandeur and religious intensity of the paintings today. The church is corrupt, yet our art has never more splendidly depicted the gods. It's all devotional, paying fealty to the king and the gods as supreme figures. Those figures are faltering." "You pay my fee, so I agree wholeheartedly," Randolph said sarcastically. "You're a visionary, madam." Isabella rubbed her hands together uncertainly. She was a visionary in a manner of speaking. She had knowledge of the future. But knowing the future and executing it were very different matters. Artists loathed working underneath Duke Albert. The moment that a new opportunity appeared, they had eagerly flocked over to different patrons in her last life. New names had risen up seemingly overnight, as all turned their focus from devotional art to new styles focusing on individualism, pleasure, beauty, self-indulgence, leisure, and intimacy. The shift in art was a reflection of the shift from royal power to widespread factionalism, where the individual position came to matter far more than the gods or the king had. Isabella had seen this occur in her previous life naturally. Albert's auction house closed 2 years from now, and he was executed for embezzlement after trying to steal money from the crown to pay the many debts his business had accrued. It was very difficult to predict the whims of the art enjoyers, but the notoriety that she'd accidentally gained put her in the perfect position to do so. "Art is one of the few spheres permitted to noble women without restriction," Isabella said after her long period of silence. "And it's perhaps the only one where they'll allow me to win." She looked to Randolph. "I can't stay out too late. I'd like you to do something for me when I'm not here." "Ask away," he said. "There are some lesser-known artists affiliated with this auction house," Isabella said. "I'd like you to see if you can't locate them." I wrote a brief description of their appearance and their names. She handed him a list. "All you need to do is find out what you can." Do I look like your bloody errand boy? He crossed his arms. In the right light, she said dryly. To the hells with you, he said, but took her paper. I'll do what I can, but don't expect much. I'm no master sleuth. Asterisk. Isabella laid in her bed, staring up at her ceiling sleeplessly as she had many nights before. A great deal had happened today. She hadn't realized just how much she had been enjoying wandering around the capital until she'd been brought back here. Randolph seemed reliable, and she didn't mind his crass tongue overmuch. She'd learned new words today, from chiaroscuro to many new vulgarities. He seemed worldly. She had many more questions about Valerio, though. Why did he terrify Randolph so? What was he after? He said that it had just been instinct, but she'd been around long enough not to buy that nonsense. Someone like him that had remained ostensibly neutral for all 8 years of her prior life didn't just act on a whim. Perhaps Valerio had been an unseen mover in her prior life. The thought made her uneasy. Once Duke Albert is done with, I should end the engagement, she mused. I can't figure out what he wants. I don't want to be used, then tossed aside. He's been nothing but gracious. But that's the problem. No one does anything without expecting something in return. Not in this place, not in this life. As Isabella rested, she heard a strange tapping noise. She turned her head to the small window. A brown woodpecker sat there, tapping at the glass. It was quiet, but difficult to ignore. For a few moments she simply hoped the bird might go away, but it persisted. She stood and walked to the window. She thought her presence might shoo it away, but it stared up at her undeterred. She tapped the glass with her nails, but still it persisted. Isabella lifted up the window slightly, not enough that it could enter, but enough she could touch it. She stared down at the bold bird confusedly. She didn't want to hurt it, but she needed to sleep. May I come in? It said, and she slammed the window back shut in shock. Isabella stared at the bird, wondering if she was dreaming. Chapter 16. After a great deal of hesitation, Isabella opened the window slightly for the bird once more. I apologize for startling you, and for any impropriety that may come with approaching a lady in the dead of night, but circumstances demanded that I approach you in an unorthodox way, the bird said to her. Isabella listened to the voice closely, then asked, Arthur. She looked at what she wore. It was winter, so her nightgown was sufficiently concealing for conversation. Indeed, the bird confirmed. I sent my familiar. Isabella's excitement soared somewhat by a display of magic that interested her a great deal, and the fatigue that had been postponed by the temporary shock was entirely shelved. She opened the window, and the bird did 3 little hops to enter her room. She looked outside briefly before pulling tight the curtains. The woodpecker stayed on her floor solemnly, its manner a little reminiscent of Arthur himself. She walked back to her bed and sat down, studying its figure closely. It had brown feathers and green eyes, rather like the wizard from which it had been born. I believe I can guess why you're here like this, Isabella said, sitting back down on the bed. The arch-wizard must have forbid you from speaking to me again. Indeed, the bird said. I'm surprised that you predicted that. I understand the office's commitment to neutrality, Isabella said. The bird looked at her with Arthur's typical solemn mannerisms. They looked quite cute on a bird. Under ordinary circumstances, that would be the end of it. But given what my actions spurred, I didn't want Her Highness to be further isolated without explanation. It shook its little head, sharp beak waving about. I wanted to inform you that Count Faust's death is on my hands. Isabella stared at the small bird. No, it isn't. It is. Her Highness is blameless, Arthur insisted. I wished to apologize for causing such an incident. Arthur spoke with his typical formal tones, but it was hard not to feel the sincerity and kindness when it came from the body of a small bird in the dead of night. The Arthur that she had known wouldn't have done such a thing. Perhaps he had changed as much as she did in the 8 years of her prior life. The fault is the king's alone, Isabella said. Don't be eager to name yourself a killer. Blood is difficult to wash from your hands. Perhaps I worried unduly. The bird stroked its head with a foot in what almost seemed an expression of embarrassment. But in case Her Highness is putting on a brave front, I felt those words needed to be said. It flapped its wings. Onto other manners. It looked at her squarely. The monologue. As far as I know, it would be impossible to help me through the bird, Isabella said dryly. Correct. My master has forbidden me from speaking to you again, at threat of stripping me of my position. The bird spread out its wings grandly. Nevertheless, I'm willing to keep my word. Isabella leaned her head back, thinking. It didn't take long for an answer to come to her. That seems unwise. Could you perhaps send someone else that you trust? Someone else, the bird repeated. Are you certain? I'm willing to do it myself. Isabella shook her head. I don't want to cause you trouble. I see. The bird paused for a while. I believe I know someone that's sufficiently discreet and skilled. Really? Isabella's face brightened in surprise. She was honestly thinking that she'd just have to wait a while longer. That's excellent. It's my mother, Arthur continued. She'll assist you. You'll receive a letter from Elaine of Asturia. Hold the back of the letter to a candle flame or some other such heat, and it'll reveal text that instructs you how to contact her. Isabella blinked for a bit, and then blurted out despite herself, You have a mother. The bird turned its head until only one of its eyes looked at her, annoyed. Did you think I blossomed from a tree like a fruit? Isabella flushed with embarrassment at her stupid question. She had simply never heard of the fact that Arthur had a mother, let alone one that was a sufficiently skilled spellcaster to help her form a monologue. I meant, your mother knows magic? Isabella asked, trying to salvage her dignity. She taught me everything that she knows, Arthur replied. In truth, her presence in my life made me somewhat sympathetic to your request. I understand all too well the stupidity of the restrictions here in Dauphine. Isabella put her hands before her. I feel as if what I did was too meager for how far you've gone out of your way for me. She lowered her head in a partial bow. Thank you for this. Sincerely. A man should keep his word, Arthur said. But that is that. This may be the last time that we speak. I'm afraid I've yet to come up with an answer as to the disease that you spoke of. Isabella smiled at the bird. Even if I fail at forming my monologue, I'll be thankful for what you've done, forever. The bird seemed to preen, somewhat, and looked from side to side expressing some unknown emotion. It hopped back to the windowsill. Good luck, Isabella, Arthur said, looking back. Even if we may not speak again, I'll keep the promise I made in the carriage. Before she could respond, the bird flew out. Isabella shut the window after it, and then collapsed back into her bed. Magic. 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 Isabella smiled, feeling like a little girl again. This had been her dream for so long. She knew that it would be challenging, but she wanted nothing more than the opportunity to pursue it. If she managed to do it, no matter how this life ended, she would think it had all been worth it. Asterisk. Arthur's familiar returned to his arm, and the green light faded from its eyes as his consciousness returned to his own body. He brought it over to its perch, and then it stepped off from his arm onto the spot elegantly. You're a twit, the arch-wizard said. I know. Arthur looked back, then nodded. Thank you for letting me do that, arch-wizard. You've never begged me for anything, the old man said. What was I supposed to do, say no? You'd just do it on your own. Despite how I speak, I do like you, somewhat. You're a good successor. At least this way, I ensured that it was done right. Arthur pushed up his glasses, enduring inquietude. Can you promise me that this is put to bed? The arch-wizard demanded. Yes, Arthur said resolutely. That was more than enough closure for me, master. If Isabella had somehow tried to extend their connection, he would have been certain she was manipulating him. But she had been the one to suggest an alternate teacher. Provided she pushed this no further, he was glad to know that Isabella had been as she seemed. Good. Because you were going to be in house for 3 months, he declared. Not a peep from you, nary a whisper. The royal court has a short memory, and they'll have forgotten about your little misadventure by then. Arthur accepted his words with a measured nod. This was a fitting price to pay, he felt. It wouldn't quite put the mistake that he made right, but it would get him back on the track where he needed to be. Arthur was magic alone. There wasn't any room in his life for anything or anyone else. That was enough, surely. Randolph, someone said, drawing him from his reading. He had come to the small library in the court of Condottieri for some quiet. One tended to read fewer books when they started swinging swords about, and so the library was often quieter than his room. Randolph looked toward the voice, Cesare. The lithe Condottiere had brown hair, eyes as white as bone, and an annoyingly handsome face. He was certainly of nobler stock than Randolph was. His father was apparently some big churchman, and fittingly, the man knew how to make friends. He'd been gathering together a small company of mercenaries, and had asked Randolph to sign up several times. "Heard you got a client," Cesare said, leaning against a bookshelf. "Congratulations," Randolph said. "Your ears work." "Heard it was some aristocrat," Cesare continued. "What did she look like again?" "Blonde hair, red eyes?" he said, just wrong enough to try and prompt correction. A clever little psychological trick. Damned weasel, Randolph thought. That woman's drawn his interest. He's trouble for her. Feel it in my guts. Oh, yes. She had hair like golden wheat ready for harvest, and eyes as red as a ruby, Randolph said grandly. If you wanted the job, I'm afraid she was looking for a bodyguard, not a gigolo. Cesare laughed. It sounded fake. How long are you going to work for people like that for a meager pay? I've always told you there's a place in my company for you. Every time Cesare had offered, Randolph had felt instinctually that it spelled nothing but trouble for him. Despite Randolph's refusal, Cesare kept advancing without stopping. He continued to gain a larger and larger reputation. Randolph almost wondered if his instincts were failing him. "What do you say?" Cesare continued. "I'll give you 20 gold. Come with me and my boys tomorrow." "Cesare. How can I put this delicately?" Randolph adjusted his book. "Piss off. I'm reading." Cesare narrowed his eyes, then turned around and walked away silently. Once he'd gone, Randolph tried to resume reading his book once more, but felt some nagging sensation in his gut. He eventually put his leather sash into the book to mark his spot and stood, walking toward another section of the library. The information for every condottiere listed in this organization was publicly available knowledge that any client or condottiere could access. It was for the benefit of the client that any and all information related to the condottiere was easily accessible, and the vast majority of those documents were here. He scanned through the section, eventually finding the place that would have Cesare's profile. He found it quickly, pulled it out, and read through it. His eyes narrowed when he read a particular note. Illegitimate son of Archbishop Pius. The Archbishop was the direct theological attendant to the crown, and the highest-ranking clergyman excluding the king, who was technically the head of the faith. It didn't take much to put the pieces together. He'd known that lady was unusual. Randolph came to a grim conclusion. I was underpaid, he thought depressingly. Chapter 17. Duke Albert and Duke Valerio sat across from each other, their faces dimly lit by the chandelier above. Duke Valerio's estate, perched right by the ocean, had a fantastic view of the churning waters. All of the windows were open, allowing the salty sea air to flow into the dining room. What do I need to give you to make you end this engagement? Albert asked. Valerio spun his knife through his fingers without saying anything. Land. Coin. Art? Favors at court? Albert leaned into the table, and it shifted from his weight. Name your price. Why are you so fixated on this? Valerio asked, his voice cold. What's so important that you can't simply find someone else, or give up this foolish pursuit? You have children twice Princess Isabella's age. I can give you pieces of art worth far more than this estate, Albert continued. I'm willing to surrender some of the most fertile lands in Dauphine. If it's about access to the royal court, there are other princesses within the royal court that you can marry. Valerio's fingers moved quicker, but he didn't speak. He seemed liable to do something foolhardy, but the door opened. Roderick walked in, carrying a silver platter. He set it on the table between them. It was a roasted pig with an apple in its mouth, supported by a heap of vegetables and fruit. Valerio caught his dagger and jammed it into the roasted pig. "When I heard you were coming, I knew that I'd be having roast pig tonight," Valerio said. "You can see the resemblance, can't you? The pig has better skin than you do, but beyond that, it's a near-perfect match." Despite the astronomical insult against him, Duke Albert stayed sitting. Both Roderick and Valerio glared at him coldly. Albert's guard stepped forward, perhaps sensing conflict, but he held his hand back and they stopped. "If you have me as a friend, we can do tremendous things together," Albert said. "You can become the heart of the royal court, as I am. The king will do as many favors for you as he presently does for me. He'll funnel unimaginable amounts of gold to your coffers. My friendship is more than equal value to what you lose." Valerio stared disinterestedly. "You could give me everything that you own, and it wouldn't be enough." "Very well." Albert stood and straightened his coat. "Have a nice evening, Duke Valerio." Albert made to leave, walking for the door. As he did, Valerio shifted, withdrawing something from his shirt. He threw his arm out. Albert's guards, well-trained, and famous in the capital, reacted, bringing their shields up. Valerio's weapon bounced off the solid steel shield, though still stabbed into the door frame right beside Albert. It was a curved dagger with a ring-shaped handle. "By the way," Valerio said casually, as though he hadn't done anything out of the norm, "I think a friend of yours left it here. He wore black, carried a lot of poison." Albert looked back and said calmly, "I'm not sure what you're talking about." "Well, hang on to it," Valerio prompted. "Who knows? What goes around tends to come around." Albert turned and left without another word. Roderick walked up and closed the door behind him, then pulled the dagger out of the wall. His aged servant looked at him. "Why didn't you take his deal?" Roderick asked, stepping into the light. "Why wouldn't I trade a person's life away without their knowledge?" Valerio asked. "Good question." Roderick looked back. "That man is going to begin prying into your life to an extreme degree. He'll look for any weakness and vulnerability. We can't afford that kind of scrutiny. He gave you the key to avoid it and profit significantly. I held my tongue because this is what I thought this had been leading to." "I've never asked you to hold your tongue," Valerio countered harshly. "You don't have a plan, do you?" Roderick stepped closer. "That was an emotional decision." Valerio leaned back in his chair, looking into Roderick's eyes unfalteringly. "And if it was?" Valerio asked, standing his ground. "Damn it, Valerio." Roderick rubbed the bridge of his nose, and then stepped forward to rebuke sternly, "There's much more than me and you at stake in this." "Why? All of this for a pretty face?" "It's more than that." Valerio shook his head, then looked out to sea. "How many days have you known her, even? This is absurd." Valerio looked back. "You saved my life without question all those years ago." He stood up. "You'd known me for days. We couldn't even speak the same language, and yet you prevented your people from killing me even when you knew it could jeopardize everything." "This is different," Roderick insisted. "Is it?" Valerio looked back. "I was shipwrecked, betrayed, and utterly alone. Lost my way, lost my ship, lost my dignity, and lost my life. I'd lost everything, damn it. And when I look at Isabella, it's like looking at a mirror to my past." He put his hands on Roderick's shoulders. "Do you have any idea what it's like to have a helping hand extended to you in your hour of need? When you're adrift, nearly dead, asking why you even bother going onward. And someone does you a kindness without expecting anything in return?" Valerio closed his eyes, perhaps reminiscing in that sensation. "I've never forgotten that feeling, Roderick. And look what it's done for us. Look how far we've come." Roderick's anger finally died as understanding dawned in his face. He eventually gave a steady nod, and Valerio stepped away. "So, you're blaming me," Roderick managed to joke. The tension between them dissipated as Valerio laughed. He walked over to the roast pig and pulled the knife out. "I learned from you," Valerio said. "Your stubbornness is a part of that." "She remains a princess," Roderick said, stepping forward. One step removed from the king himself. If Dovahane were to discover what you found, if they could sail the routes you pioneered, I know. They'd arrive at your shores, steal your land, enslave your people. It'd be hell. I promise to be your bulwark until such a time where your people could stand up against the armies of Dovahane alone. Valerio gave him a steady nod. And I will be. My eyes are a mark of that vow. And where does Isabella fit into this? Roderick questioned. Valerio walked to the balcony, where the sea washed gently against the shore. I'm not sure, he admitted. Hopefully. Wherever she wants. Isabella looked upon the artwork of the mammoth that Abigail had brought. The creature seemed fearsomely large, with tremendous white tusks and thundering feet that seemed liable to split the ground. It held its trunk up, and the art was so expressive that she could almost hear it bellowing something. It was a far different style than the majority of the artwork here, in central Dovahane. She looked over at Abigail, who held a leather-bound book in her hand. I couldn't find any paintings of walruses, Abigail explained. But I think there might be some in my sketchbook. If that interests you. Isabella smiled at her. I'd love to see it. Abigail hesitantly gave her the sketchbook. It was all done in silver point, so it's only black and white, Abigail explained. We have many mines in the north, but paint is harder to find, so most of the art we do is silver point. Art here is much prettier. Isabella opened the booklet. The first page depicted a seal. As Abigail had said, it was in black and white, but it was delightfully intricate. The seal lounged on a rock, a contented look on its face. It's very good, Isabella said sincerely. Thank you, Your Highness, Abigail said without much expression. Isabella flipped to the next page after she'd had her fill. It was another seal. This one was fatter, and seemed to be sleeping. Its whiskers were particularly detailed. Isabella smiled as she looked at it, and then flipped to the next page. It was another seal, a baby one, it looked like, with big eyes. You must have been doing this for years, Isabella remarked. Abigail said nothing, and Isabella continued to turn the pages. A seal. Another seal. Another one. Eventually, Abigail said quietly, I think it might be just seals. Isabella couldn't help but laugh, but conceded, they are quite adorable. Abigail said nothing at all, looking at the painting of the mammoth without responding. Isabella thought that she might have been opening up, but the young woman remained as closed off as ever. Perhaps that was simply her nature, and it wasn't something that could be changed. But Isabella didn't want to give up too easily. What does your father think about your art? Isabella asked, deciding to steer the conversation toward the pertinent subject. He's always liked art, Abigail said easily. He helps me whenever I need, but I don't think I want my art to be for anyone more than me. The painting of the mammoth is very different from the art down here, Isabella noted. In Dovahane, there are plenty of artists, and supplies are plentiful. Ever since we swore fealty, supplies have been easier to access, but the only truly able to paint regularly are the elite among us. Abigail looked at the painting ponderously. It was only upon coming here that I realized how far we've fallen behind the artists of the capital. Isabella nodded, then handed back the sketchbook to Abigail. She took it back, then fell silent. Could you let your father know that I'd like to speak to him? Isabella decided to say outright. I think that I see a path for his ambitions, but I'd like to discuss it with him. It would require his cooperation. Abigail nodded. I'll tell him. Isabella took one final look at the painting of the mammoth. In many ways, the paradigm shift in the art world had been a fusion of northern traditions and Dovahane artistry. Felix had been a very large benefactor for the shift in art in her prior life. But she intended to make him the very nexus of the reform, crushing Albert's business along the path. I have to go, I'm afraid, Isabella said. I have an appointment with the Duke of the Isles. Can I trust that I'll see you tomorrow as well? Abigail nodded. Isabella and Valeria rode aboard his carriage, departing from the palace with little scrutiny. She stared at him thoughtfully. "Have you thought of anything I can do for you?" Isabella asked. Him. He seemed drawn from his thoughts. "No, not particularly." Isabella only grew more and more perplexed as he continued to act like this. She had to admit that he was a large source of anxiety. It was like a single object that she couldn't quite find the place for in her plans. A nub sticking out of an otherwise flat surface. A lone protruding nail. "Would you like to eat somewhere when you're done?" Valerio proposed. "There's a place here you might enjoy. I've seen that you enjoy fruits, and desserts aren't so different." "Who told you I like fruits?" Isabella squinted suspiciously. Valerio met her gaze. "You did." "No, I didn't," Isabella insisted. "Not with words, granted. But you stole an apple from my plate. And the only thing I saw you enjoy at the ambassadorial reception was the fruit platter. The sugared raspberries, in particular." Valerio crossed his arms. "Am I wrong?" Isabella hesitated. The only reason that someone learned someone's food preference in the royal courts was to make it far easier to poison them. Considering Valerio could probably easily kill her with his hands, she didn't think that was too likely. She did quite enjoy sweets. "But I'm told they make a pear fruit tart. It is a buttery, crisp pastry crust filled with poached pears spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, arranged in a spiral over a rich custard." He crossed one leg over another. "After so long at sea, you come to appreciate finer things like fruits." It did sound very nice. But could she? Things were spiraling out of control all around. She'd already heard about King Edgar burning numerous complaint letters sent to him from the nobles associated with Count Faust. Perhaps it might give her a chance to sound out what this man really wanted from her. "I'll pay for my own meal," Isabella insisted. "Wonderful," Valerio said, looking back out the window. "I can see your guard. He looks quite distressed." ****. Randolph watched Valerio's carriage leave, his typical unease on full display whenever the Duke came around. When it turned a bend, he looked at her. "You, madam, are a recipient of Providence's most generous whims," Randolph said in way of greeting. "I am?" Isabella asked. "A living testament to cosmic fortuity. The favored darling of Lady Luck herself." He crossed his arms. "And quite stingy for a bloody princess." Isabella said nothing as she looked up at Randolph, but she was somewhat uneased. "I talked to your canvas touchers. Most of them, anyway. Found out where they live, etc. It might have been harder if these people weren't trying to get their names out actively." His hard eyes narrowed. "But someone's been sniffing around you already. Archbishop Pius. Does the name mean anything to you?" Isabella narrowed her eyes. "Of course it does." "But what?" "He sent the forbidden blossom of his sacred office sniffing around, asking about you," Randolph said. "His bastard. Cesare." Isabella's eyes widened despite herself. Cesare was the illegitimate son of Archbishop Pius. He had served as a mercenary before eventually founding his own company. His mercenaries became a pivotal force in the kingdom, becoming a peer with many of the lords in the kingdom in terms of military strength. "You're certain?" Isabella asked. "No, I like to indulge in fantastical delusions," Randolph retorted. "I simply love inspiring paranoia in my employer. Of course I'm bloody certain." Isabella took a deep breath to calm herself. This could be troublesome. But as she thought of it more, perhaps it could also be a tremendous opportunity. "Ignore him for now," Isabella said. "But I think I have an idea of what to do." Chapter 18. The value of art was closely tied to how the connoisseurs viewed the piece, more so than the technical talent behind it or other such considerations. In the days of Isabella's father, Edgar the Great had proven a patron of artists that made pieces enshrining the crown and the pantheon for the sole purpose of furthering his legitimacy and public image. He had been a master of building a reputation for himself. His preferences naturally disseminated to all those that served underneath him, as each wished to curry his favor. But that era had passed. Isabella followed Randolph's lead in helping her find the artists that she pointed out to him. It had been easy to remember their names because the success of their art had been inextricably tied to her escape from Duke Albert. She was grateful that they'd done what they had before. In this life, she hoped to make success come to them a little sooner. "I'm going to be choosing artwork for an event that's occurring soon," Isabella told the artist that she sat across. Edward of Llanlily, a disheveled-looking painter, regarded her evenly as they sat in his cramped workshop. "I have a collection of some pieces, but they're largely owned by Duke Albert," he answered. "You'd have to deal with him, unfortunately." "I'm not looking for something in a typical style," Isabella continued. "Do you have any personal paintings you prize?" "Personal paintings, my lady?" Edward repeated. "Things that you believe are excellent, but that haven't been received well by Duke Albert or the managers of his auction house," Isabella elaborated. "I do have some pieces, but—" Edward crossed his arms defensively. "They are somewhat unorthodox." Isabella smiled. "I'd like to see them." Edward went into the back, leaving Randolph and Isabella alone in this room. "This stuff seems bloody hollow, soulless," Randolph said, looking at some of the half-finished pieces. The word servile imitator come to mind. "He's just copying what others have done." Isabella looked back at her guard. "That's because he did. For these pieces, at least." "Why are we here, then?" Isabella explained patiently. "Because Edward is terrible at painting things that don't speak to his style." "Ah, yes. Eternal artistic adolescence," Randolph said. "If my mum had listened to that piss-poor excuse, I'd still be living at home waiting for my discovery instead of earning a living." Edward returned with a painting in tow, and Randolph went quiet. Isabella waited patiently as he held it in front of her, then removed the cloth covering it. In this workshop of somber, muted tones, grays, blacks, whites, flecked by the occasional dull gold or silver, the painting that Edward held seemed like a gleaming gemstone. The forest was a vivid green, the dress the woman wore was a bright pink, and the flowers in bloom all around shone with rich, bright colors. The noblewoman had thrown off her dainty heels and dipped her feet into a hot spring, lounging against a fluffy dog. It was a simple, pleasurable piece, depicting none of the grandeur of the gods or the crown. It had such intense focus to detail that the unfinished pieces around seemed to have come from a different artist. Edward certainly couldn't feign interest. But when he had interest already, few artists were better. "This is probably ill-suited for an event hosted by a lady such as yourself, I imagine," Edward said self-deprecatingly. "They refused to display it at the auction house. Deemed it far too frivolous and unserious." Isabella smiled brightly. "I think it's perfect." In her past life, a great many had agreed on the value of this painting, called the Serene Reverie. So many agreed, in fact, that it sold at an auction house that wasn't Albert's for a price in the range of 2,000 gold. While not yet comparable to the most expensive pieces sold in Albert's auction house, it marked the transition between the two clashing art styles. "Let's work out an arrangement," Isabella said decisively. Asterisk. By the end of the day, Isabella had managed introductions with several people that had become celebrated painters in her prior life, but languished in obscurity presently. Many of their most famous pieces had long ago been painted and were simply collecting dust in their personal workshop. All that she needed to focus on was setting the stage for them to shine. Isabella might have purchased the paintings for cheap outright, but instead she inquired if the artists would be amenable to displaying their pieces in an upcoming event. Isabella would only receive a 10% take of the sale if indeed such a sale happened. It was much fairer for the artists, and moreover, would help encourage people to shift away from Albert's auction houses. Now, however, she sat across from Duke Valerio, who enjoyed a sponge cake topped with some strange brown syrupy liquid that she had never seen before. She enjoyed the pear fruit tart that he told her about. She ate slowly. Frankly, she didn't want to return to the royal palace. Every second that she was away from it was one that was enjoyable. "Duke Albert came to me last night," Valerio said suddenly. Isabella tensed, looking up at him without a word. "He offered quite a grand assortment of things to end the engagement," Valerio continued, cutting a slice off of his cake. Isabella realized why he'd invited her to this place. He wanted to extract maximum value, so he was giving her a chance to put what she could on the table. His true colors revealed themselves, she thought. I told him no, and then threatened to kill him. Valerio popped the cake in his mouth. Isabella blinked, processing what he'd said. Her face flushed, feeling a little foolish for her knee-jerk suspicion. The tension drained away, but some anger remained. She squinted at him. What do you want from me? Oh, think you wouldn't go amiss, Valerio answered simply once he'd finished chewing. Of course I'm thankful, she said heavily, looking down at her tart. But please don't treat that matter lightly. I don't like being jerked down and up like that. Valerio nodded. You're right. I apologize. No, Isabella trailed off. You don't need to apologize. I don't know how else you could have said it. I simply can't get comfortable like this. Like what? Valerio asked. With you standing strong for me, while you don't ask anything of me in return, Isabella said bluntly and forcefully. I'd prefer to repay you now, rather than have the rug pulled out from beneath me later. I've done what I have because I wanted to help you, Valerio outlined clearly, and Isabella couldn't meet his gaze after. There doesn't need to be a transaction behind everything, or an expectation of reciprocation for every gesture. Sometimes a gift is a gift, and a helping hand is nothing more than what it seems. Isabella knew that he was right, but felt great resistance when she tried to accept it. I thought I had someone like that, she eventually said, staring at the table. I would tell her everything, and she would listen. I would ask for her help, and she would give it. I thought I could count on her, always. And she tried to kill me, Isabella said, her voice faltering as she said it. She had never talked about Bernadetta before, rather, she'd been avoiding it like the plague. She hadn't even seen her, or thought about her. That was by design. Frankly, she didn't know how to deal with it. Valerio pushed aside his cake and listened to her closely. Go on, he encouraged. You've been kind. More than kind. But I can't afford to think something of it, Isabella insisted. I can't. You think you can't trust your own judgment, Valerio filled in, and Isabella looked up at him in surprise for reading her thoughts. You blame yourself for not seeing it. You think that it's your own ineptitude, rather than their treachery. He nodded. I know the feeling. You do? She asked him quietly. I've been betrayed like that more than once, he admitted. I'll tell you about the one that's easier to talk about. He pointed at her. I allied with your father, as you remember, at the height of my power as a pirate. He was. Valerio chose his words carefully. A terrible force of nature. And he betrayed you, Isabella said from memory. Not him, Valerio shook his head. I knew that he didn't care about me, didn't care about my fate. But I didn't think he'd be able to get at the people that served underneath me. I underestimated just how fearsome he could be, and like many others, your father chewed me up and spat me out. Isabella had no particular affection for her father. She had barely known him. She knew more about him from the words of others, so she listened closely. We were up against the warships of the Noors, in the narrow sea to the north of here, Valerio continued. Their longships had been quite effective at coastal raids. They were slavers, and I didn't have any problem fighting them. There was a great deal of money in it for me, and the Noors themselves had some loot that my men and I were interested in. Valerio paused, his eyes going distant. My first mate. During the battle, he set fire to my whole fleet at Edgar's instruction. He used oil and the help of a cabal of mages. We became flaming balls of misery that fell upon the Noors, wiping them out to the last. A fleet that I had built up over years burned into nothing overnight. Nearly died myself, but I swam 9 miles to the coast, my leg burned up badly. He flashed a bitter smile at her. Still have the scar. 9 miles. Isabella repeated. I can't imagine. And? What happened to my first mate? Valerio guessed. He was going to be named Duke of the Isles. Suffice to say I wasn't satisfied with that arrangement, and elected to take matters into my own hands. He picked up the knife he had been using to cut the cake, and twirled it. And by matters, I mean I took his neck into my own hands. Isabella thought of Bernadetta, then asked genuinely, did that make you feel better? For 3 minutes, I felt like the king of kings. Valerio put the knife down. Then it was like it had never happened. You never forget a betrayal like that. It's always there, nagging you. He was like a brother to me. I would have taken a sword to the stomach for him, and he actually had taken one for me. Isabella looked down at her pastry, much of her appetite gone. I won't ask for your story. But this person, whoever she is, they already took away a great deal from you. My advice, if you want it, would be to make sure they don't deprive you of anything else. Your own happiness, friends, connections. Whatever. He moved his plate back in front of him, prepared to continue eating. Learn to trust in yourself first, your judgment. Once you're ready, consider trusting others. That's what worked for me, anyway. Isabella considered his words. They were insightful, measured. What sort of life had he led, to be so at ease both pirating on the open seas, or moving throughout the high society of Dauphine? He had apparently explored as a navigator, too. Isabella looked at him. You're bizarre. Valerio laughed, but didn't bother responding. What is that cake? She finally asked. Valerio looked at it, then at her. Chocolate. It's from overseas. I've never heard of it, Isabella said. It's not particularly popular, partially because it's in very limited supply. But I think it could be one day, he said, then looked at her thoughtfully. Would you like some? Isabella said nothing for a while, then nodded. At that, Valerio smiled and gracefully cut off a slice, placing it on her plate. Isabella took a small bite. It had a rich, smooth, and slightly sweet flavor with a balance of bitterness and creaminess. It was beyond good, and she looked at the Duke with somewhat wide eyes. Good, isn't it? Valerio asked. Isabella didn't answer him, instead turning back to her own tart. She couldn't say that she was quite at ease with him yet, but she was certainly glad that she'd come here. Asterisk. It's one thing to enjoy an outing with my daughter. For us to speak directly. Archduke Felix said somewhat hesitantly as they sat in the parlor of the royal palace. I've been thinking about how we can approach His Highness in a highly favorable way, and I wanted to discuss that matter with you, Isabella said. All right. Felix held his hands out. Go on. I believe that it's time for Lady Abigail's debutante ball, Isabella said confidently. I'm quite certain that I can guarantee the king's attendance. Is that right? Felix said with a raised brow. Do tell. I know that you have no love with Duke Albert, Isabella continued. As I recall, he's interfered with your efforts multiple times. He's poached very valuable artists from me, yes, the Archduke agreed. Why is his name coming up? Albert buys favor with the king from exhibits of artistry, Isabella continued. Edgar very much enjoys the fine arts. Abigail may struggle on some fronts, but her knowledge of art is far more substantial than most noble ladies. For that reason, I'd like to take a two-pronged approach. She held her hands out like a scale. We'll have both an exhibit of fine art and Abigail's debutante ball in one. The king will attend. Without doubt. The Archduke stood up and walked around the parlor. That's unconventional. And highly expensive. Duke Albert's service fees. On the contrary, Isabella said. If you leave it to me, Your Grace, the entire hall can be filled with eye-catching masterpieces at no charge to you. That'd be no different than declaring war on Duke Albert's dominance over the arts, the Archduke pointed out. Duke Albert is a large man, Isabella said. Push him out of the way, and there's plenty of room to stand beside the king. There are few ways to move a man like that without a war. The Archduke gave a slow, malevolent smile. Tell me more. The end.